Welcome, folks. You're here listening to Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson, and this is WJOP Newburyport 96.3. I'm glad you were able to kind of find the time to dial in and check out what this soul brother has to say. We're going to really launch into a conversation about the notion of equity and justice, and what does equity and justice look like in society. And I've been really thinking about this quite a bit, particularly because I was recently listening to a lecture, a talk that conservative pontificator and thinker Thomas Sowell had to say. And if you're not familiar with Thomas Sowell is, I'm just going to say it, he's brilliant. He is smart. I am not going to dismiss that. Anyone who wanted to stand in front of him, engage in any type of discourse or debate, oh, you better prepare. You better be ready. Thomas Sowell is an interesting individual too, particularly because he's multiracial. He is Black, and I believe he identifies as something else that is non-white in terms of his own formulaic identity that's there. Thomas Sowell, interestingly enough, was a high school dropout. Thomas Sowell didn't finish high school, and yet he has become one of the premier economists, public intellectuals, thinkers, someone who has really captured the imagination of conservative people. Now, I say all of this because I'm just being honest about the brilliance of Thomas Sowell. That being said, Thomas Sowell and I disagree on many things. Oftentimes, when I read Thomas Sowell's works, when I listen to him give a talk, I'm often perplexed and confused about his thoughts towards people who look like me, people who look like him. And when you lean in and you listen to him, he is almost like a robot. He sees the world in a colorblind fashion, really believes that race has nothing to do with anything. Thomas Sowell will be the first person, as we're thinking about this topic of equity and justice or social justice today, where he'll tell you the problem with Black people, all the things that we have done wrong as a people, and the reason why we have various levels of disadvantages within a predominantly white society that's starting to change, particularly here in the United States as we creep closer toward the year 2041. Thomas Sowell is someone who would delve in and he would articulate notions that we overthink the word fairness. He would say that the world is not fair and that you need to play the hand that you've been dealt, whatever that looks like. He would also go ahead and really articulate this notion that while you're playing that hand that you've been dealt, there should be absolutely no government interference whatsoever in promoting an equitable society that's there. I mean, it's quite interesting because Thomas Sowell, that brother's got to be, I don't know, in his 80s, early 80s. And he grew up in a time in which the world told him he was excluded and did not belong in terms of the way the world had situated this field. And speaking of the field, Thomas Sowell would articulate the fact that it's a fair, even playing field. You land on it, and then again, you navigate and you operate in the ways that you have to. When we think about this term equity, we think about equality, when we think about issues of social justice, we have to think about the fact that equality is typically understood as providing the same level of opportunity and assistance to all segments of society. That's equality. Equity, on the other hand, describes providing various levels of support and assistance depending on specific needs or abilities of certain groups. I like to think about the notion that we oftentimes think about equality, but we have to think about equality in a way that Thomas Sowell would think about it, which I actually agree with him. And that is, we are not all equal. There are certain advantages that are inherent that some have that others do not have. Case in point, I'm an able-bodied person. And being an able-bodied person, I have both my legs, I have the capacity to move into spaces that not all people have for various reasons, whether they were in an accident, for example, maybe it was the condition by which they were born in. Myself as an able-bodied person can move in spaces that maybe someone else cannot. Someone who is not able-bodied, particularly in the ways that I am able-bodied, are not going to exist in a framework of equality. That being the case, though, here's where Thomas Sowell and I, well, you know what? And I want to give one more example of that before I move on. And that is this notion, and this is the one that I like to give folks. I will never be able to dunk a basketball like Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is 6'6". I'm 5'9". And the only time I've ever been able to dunk a basketball, and like so many of you, I suspect, is when I was able to lower the basketball rim, kind of go up and bring it down just a little bit. And even then, I still couldn't dunk like Michael Jordan. But in that sense, as a basketball player, there's not going to be a notion of equality because Jordan has height advantages that I don't have. That's there. There are other ways in which society has constructed a world in which there's no equality that's there. Some folks grew up in a household with highly educated parents. They have libraries and books and artwork. They've been able to travel the world and engage with a range of different types of people that have really enhanced the vocabulary and where they are. That goes back to some notions of class orientation, which we also know there's a relationship between class orientation and race. So, to my point on thinking about equity, if we were just to operate from this notion that Thomas Sowell is operating from, in which he's saying, you know what, we should just operate from a fair playing field, then if that's the case, we need to provide elements of equity to allow people opportunities to be engaged citizens, to be educated, to be participatorial folks who are engaged. You can't have a school and say it's an equitable school to educate all, and yet you don't have a ramp for someone who needs assistance, someone who's in a wheelchair. How is that person able to get to class to learn when they don't have access to get to the space or the facilities that are there? Another example, of course, would be, and this is just a reality, there are certain folks who learn differently, who may need a little bit more time or additional time in order to do some of the same tasks that others may not need. And really giving them the resources they need in order to be successful just makes common sense along the way. If we were to operate from the sense that, you know what, here's what we're going to do. And Thomas Sowell was one of those people who was very critical of elements, particularly thinking about the College Board of Testing Services, who give extended or different, additional, I should say, time to others. Well, how do we know people can do their best and be their best? I believe, and again, as you should always do, check me on things. I'm not sure, but I think the service academies, like the Air Force Academy, West Point, and all those others that are there, do not allow anyone to have additional time on standardized testing. And I'm not even going to get into the problem of standardized testing, right? I mean, again, Thomas Sowell and I, we definitely disagree with that because he would say we all, regardless of our background, our class status, where we're coming from, should take the exact same test and expect the same results. He would contend that that is an element of fairness that belongs. That's the thing that's really part of this nomenclature, these categories, right, that really shape and define society that's there. I push back on that because, see, if we're thinking about equity and you have someone who is living in a particular neighborhood, didn't have certain levels of faculty members, teachers, educated in a particular way, didn't have the resources necessary in order for them to be successful, You can't set them up in a way to be prepared to engage in a game in which the rules are not the same. See, many conservatives, particularly even Thomas Sowell leading the way, would say, Eddie, that's where you're wrong. People have to really pull themselves up, work a little bit harder, try a little bit more, and then they'll be successful. I don't, I do not disagree with the fact that people have to want it. You have to be motivated. You have to desire and want to spend the effort and the work to do that. But you have to make sure that the playing field is level and you have an opportunity to get there. Because, see, having ambition and drive and desire to do that is not always enough. You could have that ambition, drive, and desire to want to learn, to want to take a course. But yet, when that class is on the third floor and there's no elevator to get you to the third floor when you need that elevator, you're already at a disadvantage that's there. Thomas Sowell and I would really kind of see this. And it's interesting too, because, I'm always perplexed, and not to make this an ideological thing, but really to say that, well, I'm conservative, and to be conservative means that you shouldn't have opportunities because of various levels of disadvantages or ways in which you've not been advantaged is problematic. The concept of equity zeroes in on fairness of treatment as opposed to whether or not outcomes or the treatment itself are equal. Equity might, for example, all right, let's think about this. Equity might be said to exist if two people each get different medical treatment because they each have different conditions, each calling for different measures. Equity can also be said to exist if two people each get different amounts of prison time because each sentence equally fit the crime. An equitable system means a system that is perceived to be fair, right? Equitable. Equity exists for a reason. Equity exists when people have been treated fairly. However, this is perhaps where that that disagreement ends, because people disagree both about what counts as fairness and what steps are needed to make existing societies fair. And there's disagreement. Some folks would say, Eddie, it is your fault that you're on welfare. It's all your fault. You should have worked harder. You should have tried harder. You should have done better. And yet people don't understand the ways in which society works, not seeing that maybe Eddie didn't grow up in the posh apartment complex or suburban neighborhood and have the advantage of their socioeconomic status that's there. Now, folks, I'm not sitting here saying that there haven't been folks in those situations and communities who have not found ways. But it's interesting when we think about the way networks operate that allows a kind of support system that is needed. I'm simply saying that people should pause and step back for a second and really think about what they're thinking about when they just disregard folks for not caring or working hard enough. When we think about, let's think about, kind of the macro element here. When we think about public policy, when some people hear the word equity, they hear redistribution or a system in which resources are reallocated to favor groups. That's not fair. They get this and I don't get that. What does that mean? Is this some kind of socialist system that's going to be underway that is problematic, particularly in terms of the paradigm that's being created here? This is where people just, my opinion, right? And this is an I perspective here, feel bitter and upset, angry at a system in which we want to create a society in which all citizens can lean in and engage and feel like they're truly a part of a community that's there and that is necessary. A system in which resources are allocated in a way that allows people to enter into that classroom building. Take a class and learn in the ways in which they want to, and not have to figure out how they're going to get up to the third, fourth, fifth, or 15th floor in order to take a calculus course, which, by the way, I've never taken a calculus course a day in my life. I should have probably leaned into math a little bit more, because I'll be the first to say here, right? I could have worked a little harder in math and given myself maybe a better opportunity that was there. When we think about this lens or this view of equity, or equity as being fundamentally unfair because it effectively punishes productive people in order to give to those who did not earn those things of their own merit, that's challenging, right? And it really kind of leans back a little bit when we look at this culture war that's underway. You're seeing a lot of folks who are attacking DEI or DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. What you're starting to hear are things such as, you're hearing things such as, Eddie must have been a DEI hire. I've heard that about Kamala Harris running for president of the United States. She's clearly in this position because she's a DEI hire, right? The system is rigged and it is advantaging folks who, are given leeway beyond the rest of folks who are operating in the same sphere. Some see equity as being the underpinning of liberal, or better yet, not even liberal, left-wing, radical left-wing, socialist or communist government, because resources would be taken away from one group and given to another favorite group. And this is perceived as being unfair because, again, it's benefiting underserved people in society who have not worked hard enough. Equity is contributing to inequality. But yet, when we look at the way things are situated, right, equity is really designed to bring an end, to limit elements of marginalization. Equity is designed to create a fair playing field in which folks can engage in ways that others can't. I mentioned, for example, the SAT, and I have lots of problems with standardized tests. My number one problem with standardized tests is the word standardize. Standardized tests assume that all schools are equitable, are already fair, that everyone should score at least at a certain level on a standardized test so they have access to certain educational institutions that are there, right? That is the assumption. But yet, not only do states and educational systems operate differently, within a state, school districts operate differently, right? I mean, think about this. If you're in the Massachusetts area and you're attending a public school in, say, I don't know, Concord, Massachusetts, which is one of the more affluent areas, versus another community that is nowhere near as affluent, because public education is centered on notions of revenue, particularly when it comes to income taxes. Now let's think about who has more resources. Faculty members, teachers who can make more money, who are going to have a greater desire to be in areas with better facilities, perceive stronger students, because those students have worked their way up in a system that has naturally benefited them, right? No one wants to think about these things in that particular way. And so when we think about standardized testing, you can't have a standardized test and then talk about a standard equitable society. It's not. I oftentimes tell folks, for example, that standardized testing is not a measure on how good a student is. It's a measure on the amount of dollars and how affluent their parents are. or family members, I should say, right? And we're not testing family members. We're testing young folks. We're testing students at all ranges and all levels. And that's what we have to think about. Many conservatives consider it unfair to provide special treatment in a way because of they see this as an aggregate situation. And what I mean is they see this as fundamentally inequitable. Such arraignments violate what they would call basic principles of equity, that people each get treated as an individual in accordance with their individual merit. I mean, these are some of the folks who have been strongly in opposition to affirmative action policies. They've voted and made political decisions to elect people who would, again, put people on the Supreme Court who would say, guess what? Here's what we're seeing. The end of affirmative action because affirmative action discriminates. Affirmative action doesn't discriminate. Affirmative action is just a tool for equity to make sure people have access. That's what people need to think about. Others, usually liberal folks, people who are on a liberal side, believe that certain inequities need to address or be addressed by some type of intervention or some type of engagement, whether those inequities are caused by things that happen in the past or the present, right? Henceforth, the reason why we created affirmative action programs, and we think about that, leftists, left-leaning folks sometimes point back to 1865, right? 1865, I suspect everyone know, but if you don't, was when the enslaved were emancipated. And very few of the newly emancipated slaves were given 40 acres and a mule. This whole notion that, well, we're going to end not affirmative action, we're going to end slavery. And in the process of ending slavery, we're going to give them 40 acres and a mule. Oh, you want to talk about a myth? That is not the case. And therefore, had to accept brutal forms of employment that replicated slavery because they didn't get that brutal form of employment and really thinking about replicating slavery. We know that as Jim Crow. Black people left one form of slavery to enter and engage into a whole nother level of slavery, and particularly elevating by the time we get to 1877. So not a long period to really address some of those things that were there. Some conservatives, of course, respond by saying, well, giving special treatment to historically disadvantaged groups is more than unfair. That was a long time ago, and we have nothing to do with slavery today. Huh. I mean, that's interesting because if you think about this, right? My parents, particularly my mother, was a product of a Jim Crow education. I'm her firstborn child, right? That's how close we are connected to Jim Crow. And as I stated, Jim Crow is just a continuity of another form of slavery that's there. If anything, what I really want people to do is I want people to pause and I want them to think about, why are folks so upset by having a just society that is equitable, that is diverse, a society in which everyone has an opportunity to lean into the good funk of being productive citizens? Isn't that what we want? You can't be conservative and talk about values and institutions and freedoms when you've already limited folks to the levels and the types of freedoms that they have that they have the right and opportunities to engage in. That is what folks need to do. So as we continue to see the bashing of words diversity, equity, inclusion, and then one that has recently emerged in some ways to make folks feel good, it is even part of my title as the Dean of Residential Life and Belonging at my institution, right? That belonging aspect that goes with DEI or DEIB. I ask, Why is this challenging and problematic to folks? What is the fear? What are people scared of? That's what I want to know. Folks, I really wanted to give you a little food for thought here, something to chew on, and I hope you will think about this. If you have any thoughts, you have any questions, you want to engage, shoot, if you want to come on my show and have a conversation with me, with Brother Carson, you can reach out to me at Race Matters Podcast at gmail.com. You can go to my website, professorcarson.com. I welcome the conversation because, see, I believe in radical love. I believe that we should live in a world where justice is there. And in order to have justice, there's got to be equity, because you can't go right to justice without any element of form of justice. Folks, you're listening to WJOP, Newburyport, Massachusetts. I'm Eddie Carson. This is Race Matters here at 96.3. I hope you'll lean in and check out the show on 96.3. You'll go find my show on YouTube. You can also find my show and other shows on my website. Be well. Until next time, take care.